Good afternoon, Quasar Markets Live. There's so much going on in the world, Nathan, and I've got him here, Nathan Dean, senior analyst for policy here at Bloomberg, right here at Quasar Markets Live. I'm going to let you just talk because there is so much to talk about, Nathan. I'm going to let you do it.
Yeah, so every Monday I write a newsletter for Bloomberg News, and I thought that, the way that I would approach the situation, what's going on in Iran at the moment, was to look at it by asset class. Now, this full disclosure, so I'm not a geopolitical analyst, I'm a U.S. domestic analyst, but, if you don't know that our friends at Bloomberg Economics, who sit actually just on the other side of those monitors, have a team of geopolitical strategists that have been looking at this. And so the way that, we've been thinking of Iran in terms of just where things are going and where things are headed and so forth is, it seems that the markets are somewhat, predicting that this is going to be a short-term resolution. I was looking at the prediction markets just this morning, and that, just looking at the contracts, Kalshi has a contract out there in terms of where this is going to end, or when is this going to end. And the majority of the people who are on that contract think that this could be over in the month of March. Now, here in Washington, there's going to be some news headlines coming out later today when it's tied to what is known as a war resolution that's being put forth by Senator Tim Kaine. Now, this would be a resolution that disapproves President Trump's authority to use the military to go forth and have its conflict with Iran. If the Senate or the House won, there's one from the Senate and there's one from the House, if those were to pass, it would then go to the president to certainly veto this. Now, why is this vote being held? Well, for really two reasons. One, Congress is, and forget, Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, just go back 50 years, 60 years. I mean, the last time Congress declared war on somebody was December 8th, 1941 against Japan. Congresses don't like it when presidents start conflicts. You hear this all the time, that it should be Congress that it's actually doing this authorization. President George W. Bush tried in the early 2000s for Iraq. That didn't happen. So, whenever the president gets into power, they begin to say, look, I just don't need the authorization for Congress. And then Congress always responds like that. The second reason why you're going to see this War Powers resolution is essentially to put people on notice. Right now, according to the polls, I've seen 3 polls that have come out since the conflict has began. The one that I think is most indicative of where we are right now is the CNN poll that came out yesterday that showed that 60% of Americans are against this idea of the conflict. Now, full disclosure on this polling, this was essentially a worded question of, are you for what President Trump did or not? I think as time changes, that number will change. But if we just use the assumption that 60% of the American populace are against this, Senator Tim Kaine is looking at that and saying, look, we have all 435 members of the House of Representatives up for a re-election in November. We have 1/3 of the Senate. Let's put everybody on notice and put them on record so that if that number were to creep upwards, you then have a story that makes things a little bit more uncomfortable for the folks coming in November. I'm not saying that anything's going to change with this. When President Trump says, I don't need congressional input to continue this conflict with Iran, he's absolutely correct. He doesn't. There's nothing here that the Congress is going to do to stop this, but essentially it's just going to be a headline exercise. If you were to see one of the 2 chambers pass its resolution, potentially that could, speed things up maybe, but again, it's just something that we're looking at. But we are getting the question from clients of what is Congress doing, or what are people looking at, with the conflict continuing abroad? Well, Congress is still continuing to work. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is currently testifying on Capitol Hill. President Trump just gave a pseudo press conference in the Oval Office with the German president. For what it's worth, there was some good intel from that press conference. There was a tariff update. Now, if you remember, when President Trump lost the Supreme Court case on tariffs, they said you can't use IEEPA tariffs anymore. So they immediately transitioned to what is known as a Section 122 tariff. This allows tariffs globally for whatever countries you want up to 150 days. Now, President Trump said in that pseudo press conference that we're at 15%. For what it's worth, officially, we're still at 10%. They have not signed an executive order or put it into the record to move up to 15%. So tariffs today are still at 10%. But President Trump did talk about, and he was saying things like, we're going to cut off all trade with Spain. He's currently not happy with Spain because of their defense spending, also because they did not allow the United States to utilize their bases. A lot of the tankers were based in Spain, and so they had to go to other countries. So President Trump's not happy with Spain at the moment. He was talking about things like cutting off all trade with Spain. Well, essentially, where this is going is that he asked the trade representative, Jameson Greer, what can we do in this situation? And Jameson Greer essentially said there's a lot of avenues that we have. SCOTUS actually, reaffirmed our authority to use IEPA in certain instances. But he also said for these Section 122 tariffs that are at 10% right now and have to be authorized by Congress within 150 days, I was under the opinion that we would never see a congressional vote on this. Jameson Greer actually just confirmed it and said within the 150 days, within those 5 months, they would be able to transfer those Section 122 tariffs at 10% to what is known as a Section 301 or a Section 232 tariff. 301 is an unfair trade practice tariff. Section 232 is a tariff on a sectoral. So think Section 301 against China, Section 232 against semiconductors. So because these investigations are going to take time, they're going to complete it before those 5 months, and then they'll be able to say that they won't need congressional authorization going forward. So that was some intel that we literally just got out from watching the Oval Office. But the other thing that Congress is working at this week that's going to drive a little bit of the headline risk for those of you in the housing space is that there is a housing bill that the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee, they've been working on this for some while. It's a very bipartisan bill. Most of it in here is cutting regulatory red tape. So if you're an investor in housing or anything like this, I don't think it excites you all that much. Think of things like, rather than it being $1,000 to go through, closing on a new house, they're going to try and cut some regulatory tape so it make it like $400. Don't get me wrong. That's great. I remember when I closed on my house, I hated those closing costs. That's great. But it's not going to dramatically shift, the purchase of new homes. But there is a provision. There's actually two provisions that the Senate Banking Committee inserted in last night that's worth talking about. The first one is President Trump's idea of banning corporations from purchasing single-family homes. Now, if you've attended one of my calls in the past or if we've talked, you know that I was at a 40% chance that this was going to pass. Well, they had an initial vote in the Senate last night. It's called the cloture vote. Think of it as the opening vote before you get to the bigger vote. And it passed 84-6. It had bipartisan support. So our odds are now going above 50% that this bill is going to pass. And for what it's worth, if I ever make a call wrong and I see you in person here in the office, I buy you a Bloomberg coffee. Bloomberg coffees are free, but they are still the best coffee in the world for the price point. So I will buy you a Bloomberg coffee if you ever see me in person. But the thing that you should note is that when this bill passes, there are exemptions in here. So if you're looking at like Invitation Homes or AMH, or even if you're looking at Blackstone, when this initially came out, Blackstone had it took like a 4 or 5% hit in the markets. For what it's worth, we think those exemptions for like Invitation Homes and AMH will allow those family REITs to avoid a lot of this. And Blackstone, we're talking about 0.6% of their assets under management. I mean, Blackstone didn't deserve a 4% hit when that initially came out just because they're a diversified revenue base. So keep that in mind when this bill passes. And then lastly, I mentioned there was another provision in this housing bill. It's not related to housing. It's related to crypto. There was an insertion of a provision that would ban the United States from launching, or would ban the Federal Reserve from unilaterally launching a central bank digital currency up until 2030. Now, if you've talked to Republicans and you've talked to President Trump, you may have heard that they are not on board with this idea of a central bank digital currency. And for what it's worth, the Federal Reserve was never really on board with this idea either. But this provision was inserted in order to codify it into law that between now and 2030, you would never see the creation of a central bank digital currency unless Congress gave explicit permission to the Federal Reserve, aka pass a law that would create a central bank digital currency. Just as an FYI, that's in there as well. But going forward, I think the geopolitical stuff is going to really drive a lot of the headlines. It's going to drive a lot of the scenarios. So again, if it's one of those things where the domestic policy is going to continue, but as long as the Iran conflict, that's going to be the main driver for what we see come out of Washington.
Yeah, and when you look at this fight, I don't even know what to call it, because it's not really a war, because Congress can declare, as you said, and we know that, right? It's that Georgetown side of me coming out, I guess now. What is it that Congress really wants to see? I mean, on the Republican side, do they want to see a quick resolution? Iran is now owned by the United States, or the new regime is in place. The Democrats obviously want to politicalize the whole thing and win. I get all that, but what is it that there is no answer from Trump as to what it is that he really wants to see out of this police action, shall we say?
Yeah, so let me just give me 1 second, because he actually put out the White House social media account actually just put out about an hour and a half ago their objectives. Let me see if I can find it real quick.
Is it on X? I can probably find it for you if that's okay.
Yeah, it's on X, but for some reason I can't seem to find it. So, but essentially it was not talking about regime change. It was talking about air supremacy. It was talking about destroying missiles. It was talking about tactical objectives, specifically in terms of the operations. Now, Bloomberg News has been reporting that Qatar and the UAE were privately lobbying other allies in the Gulf region to try and figure out how President Trump can have an off-ramp to this. I think anybody who's been to Dubai knows that that's not good for their image to see missiles coming into the Palm, for example, and all that other stuff. So. I think when I talk to my colleagues over Bloomberg Economics and Bloomberg News and so forth like that, the idea here is this a tactical operation, or is this a strategic operation and tied to regime change? Well, there is going to be regime change no matter what. So I'll just say that, I think, this is one of those situations where we just really don't know. In terms of your first question about Congress, there are some Democrats that are actually on board with President Trump's strategy. I mean, Representative Gottheimer out of New Jersey said he was in support of this. Senator Fetterman said that he was in support of this. On the Republican side, it's just this idea that, there's a significant number of Republicans out there. And I think anybody who's watching this call who lived in the early 2000s knows what happened with the Iraq War. Right. And so there's just a significant number of policymakers on both sides that want to ensure that these objectives are clear and concise in the way that they can measure what the ultimate outcome is.
But when you look at 2000, I mean, that was yellow cake, and that was Niger, and there was this. I mean, everything under the sun was the question mark, right? And Vice President Cheney was bringing it out that there was a reason why we went. Here, it didn't seem that it was laid out beforehand. It just we just went in and really just, I mean, like I said on my own show, like you don't put that many ships in the Middle East into the Strait of Hormuz and the Med and not go to war, right? So there was definitely a buildup. At the next round. And you just said it earlier in the show that Kalshi, I guess, thinks this is done within less than a month. Is that really the feeling right now that by April, May we'll be out of this and life's good again?
I've heard policy experts say yes. I've heard policy because due to the fact that the United States and Israel seems to be getting air supremacy fairly quickly. President Trump even just announced that Iran has lost most of its missile launchers. My colleague Becca Wasser even said this morning that we're getting to the point where the United States is running out of pre-planned targets and will now have to use intelligence to actually create new targets. So there is this theory that it could be over sooner rather than later. But then the question is that if Iran is trying to use their operations to essentially prolong the conflict in terms of making it pain in terms of missiles and expenditures, that's why you hear a lot of people talk about expenditures of missiles, just because if we get into a situation where Iran still has drones, forget the missiles, but even just drones, we saw in one analysis this morning that, if a drone costs $100,000 and you're shooting it down with a $4 million missile, well, the math doesn't really add up there for a long-term solution. So it's still extremely muddied. And I would hate to say that I have a good feeling either way where this is going, just because of, things are changing at the moment.
And the market's clawed back half of the losses from this morning. So it seems that a lot of people are just buying the dip here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of those situations where I think the markets are, sort of just going on the idea that this is going to be a short-term conflict and that, you aren't going to see anything like a tremendous closure of the Strait of Hormuz or anything like that. So I think that, when you look at it from the Washington perspective, I think most policymakers and lawmakers would prefer that this ends quicker, sooner rather than later.
I'm on your side, and I hope this ends quickly. All right, Nathan Dean from Bloomberg. We love it. Thank you so much, senior analyst there, public policy. Appreciate it. We'll see you right back here next week.
Great. Thank you.